Président.
Oh, the press is closed. Okay,
Okay.
welcome back.
Good, right. Good afternoon. We, the UK, Denmark, France, Greece and Slovenia, called for today's urgent meeting of the Security Council on the situation in Gaza. First, we want to welcome the release of Idan Alexander yesterday and reiterate our call for all of the remaining hostages who have been cruelly held by Hamas for over 18 months to be released immediately. Their suffering must end. The Security Council has been consistent and clear on this since the brutal terror attack on the 7th of October. Hamas must have no future role in Gaza or be in a position to threaten Israel. Israel has now fully blocked aid entering Gaza for over 2 months. Blocking aid as a pressure lever is unacceptable. And last week, the Israeli Security Cabinet approved plans to expand its military operations in Gaza. We strongly oppose both these actions, which will add to Palestinian suffering while doing nothing to serve the long-term interests of peace and security in the region, nor to secure the safe return of the hostages. Any attempt by Israel to annex land in Gaza would be unacceptable and violate international law. Palestinian territory must not be reduced nor subjected to any demographic change. On the humanitarian situation, the World Food Programme have told us they already have no food left. Palestinian civilians, including children, face starvation as a result. Just yesterday, the IPC released a report warning that Gaza's entire population is already at critical risk of famine. Without an urgent lifting of the aid block, more Palestinians are at risk of dying, deaths that could easily be avoided. Humanitarian aid must never be used as a political tool or a military tactic. We're also deeply concerned at proposals to establish a new mechanism for the delivery of aid, which the UN has said would not meet humanitarian principles. International law requires Israel to allow and facilitate the safe, rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian aid and ensure that basic services are provided for all Gazan civilians. This applies to all armed conflicts around the world. Gaza is not an exception. We have 2 clear messages for the government of Israel. Lift the block on aid entering Gaza now and enable the UN and all humanitarians to save lives. Any model for distributing humanitarian aid must be independent, impartial and neutral, and in line with international humanitarian law and principles. We cannot support any model that places political or military objectives above the needs of civilians, or that undermines the UN and other partners' ability to operate independently. We are also outraged by the killing of Palestinian Red Crescent workers and the hit on a UN compound on the 19th of March. Humanitarian aid workers and UN premises must be protected. We call on Israel to complete and release the findings of its investigation into the UN compound incident and take concrete action to ensure this can never happen again. At least 418 aid workers have been killed in Gaza since the conflict began. That is at least 418 too many. We urge Israel to investigate all incidents transparently, to be clear on the steps taken to hold those responsible to account, and reinstate an effective deconfliction system. The only way to end the suffering of both Palestinians and Israelis is for an immediate return to a ceasefire, the release of all the hostages, and to urgently advance efforts to achieve a two-state solution. This is the only way to achieve long-term peace and security for both Palestinians and Israelis, and we welcome France and Saudi Arabia's leadership in chairing an international conference on the two-state solution here in New York in June. I thank you.
In 2006, when the Palestinians had a chance to go to the polls, they elected Hamas. Now, why you give yourself the right to confiscate the right of the Palestinians to choose their leader? Why you don't put pressure on Abbas to open the area for free and fair elections and see who the Palestinians want to choose?
So the purpose of the Security Council meeting today, when we'll have briefings from OCHA and the World Food Programme, is to talk about the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza. We'll move on to other considerations, but today's focus is the humanitarian situation.
Ambassador, when you expressed concern in your statement about the aid mechanism, are you referring specifically to the aid mechanism that's been put forward by the United States, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation?
So this is the aid mechanism that is currently being discussed, was put forward, I think, initially by Israel and is now being considered by the United States, and the UN is concerned that it won't do the work. Thank you very much.
You have a very strong statement. Do you expect strong actions from the Security Council?
Today we're going to look at the humanitarian situation, and we will of course keep you updated on further action. Thank you.
Thank you.
The 9,914th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Israel and the United Arab Emirates to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in the meeting in accordance with provisional rules of procedures and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Tom Fletcher, Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, and Ms. Angelica Jacom, Director of the Food and Agriculture Organization Liaison Office with the United Nations. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Tom Fletcher.
Mr. President, members of the Council, briefing you again on this subject is a grim undertaking. Before starting, I ask you to reflect for a moment on what action we will tell future generations we each took to stop the 21st century atrocity to which we bear daily witness in Gaza. It is a question we will hear, sometimes incredulous, sometimes furious, but always there for the rest of our lives. We will surely all claim to have been against it. Maybe we will say we issued a statement, or that we trusted that private pressure might work despite so much evidence to the contrary. Or pretend that we thought a more brutal military offensive had more chance of bringing the hostages home than the negotiations which brought so many hostages home. Maybe some will recall that in a transactional world, we had other priorities. Or maybe we will use those empty words, we did all we could. Mr. President, let me start with what we see and are mandated by this Council to report. Israel is deliberately and unashamedly imposing inhumane conditions on civilians in the occupied Palestinian territory. For more than 10 weeks, nothing has entered Gaza, no food, medicine, water, or tents. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians have again been forcibly displaced and confined into ever-shrinking spaces, as 70% of Gaza's territory is either within Israeli militarized zones or under displacement orders. As my colleague from the FAO will explain, every single one of the 2.1 million Palestinians in the Gaza Strip face the risk of famine. 1 in 5 face starvation. Despite the fact that you have funded the food that could save them. The few hospitals that have somehow survived bombardment are overwhelmed. The medics who have somehow survived drone and sniper attacks cannot keep up with the trauma and the spread of disease. Even today, the European Gaza hospital in Khan Yunis was bombed again with even more civilian casualties reported. I can tell you from having visited what's left of Gaza's medical system that death on this scale has a sound and a smell that does not leave you. As one hospital worker described it, children scream as we peel burnt fabric from their skin. And yet we hear that we did all we could. Mr. President, our response as humanitarians is to make a single ask of the Council. Let us work. The UN and our partners are desperate to resume humanitarian aid at scale across Gaza in line with the fundamental principles of humanity, impartiality, independence, and neutrality. We have a plan. We have shown we can deliver with tens of thousands of trucks reaching civilians during the ceasefire. We have life-saving supplies ready now at the borders. We can save hundreds of thousands of survivors. We have rigorous mechanisms to ensure our aid gets to civilians and not to Hamas. But Israel denies us access, placing the objective of depopulating Gaza before the lives of civilians. It is bad enough that the blockade continues. How do you react when Israeli ministers boast of it? Or when attacks on humanitarian workers and violations of the UN's privileges and immunities continue, along with restrictions on international and non-governmental organizations? Mr. President, this Council has adopted resolutions that demand all parties to the conflict comply with international humanitarian law and protection of civilians, including humanitarian personnel. A reminder that Israel also has clear obligations under international humanitarian law. It must treat civilians humanely, with respect for their inherent human dignity. It must not forcibly transfer, deport, or displace the civilian population of an occupied territory. As the occupying power, it must agree to aid and facilitate it. So for anyone still pretending to be in any doubt, the Israeli-designed distribution modality is not the answer. It practically excludes many, including people with disabilities, women, children, the elderly, the wounded. It forces further displacement. It exposes thousands of people to harm. It sets an unacceptable precedent for aid delivery, not just in the OPT, but around the world. It restricts aid to only one part of Gaza, while leaving other dire needs unmet. It makes aid conditional on political and military aims. It makes starvation a bargaining chip. It is a cynical sideshow, a deliberate distraction, a fig leaf for further violence and displacement. If any of that still matters, have no part in it. Mr. President, for the record, we have tried. The UN has met 12 times, and again this morning, with the Israeli authorities to discuss this proposed modality. We wanted to find a way to make it possible. We repeatedly explained the minimum conditions for our involvement on the basis of long-settled fundamental principles. Aid based on independent assessments of who needs it, the globally tested and donor-demanded basic requirement, and the ability to deliver aid to all those in need, wherever they are. The Secretary-General set out the relevant international law in his submissions to the International Court of Justice. And your resolutions have strongly condemned starvation of civilians as a method of warfare and the unlawful denial of humanitarian access. Resolution 2417 demands the Council's full attention to widespread conflict-induced food insecurity. Mr. President, it's not just Gaza. Appalling violence is also increasing in the West Bank, where the situation is the worst in decades. The use of heavy weaponry, military methods of war, excessive force, forcible displacement, demolitions and movement restrictions, ongoing illegal settlement expansion. Entire communities destroyed, refugee camps depopulated, settlements expanding and settler violence continuing at alarming levels, sometimes with the support of Israeli forces. Recently, settlers abducted a 13-year-old girl and her 3-year-old brother. They were found tied to a tree. Do we also say to them that we did all we could? Mr. President, there is, I fear, a broader context here. For the past 19 months, Palestinian journalists, civil society, and individuals have live-streamed their destruction to the world. Many have been targeted and killed for their testimony. And during this time, international aid workers have been the only international civilian presence in Gaza, watching and reporting the unfolding horror. We are your eyes and your ears. And be in no doubt that we feel the weight of that responsibility to you, to the communities we serve, and to the world. And so we have briefed this council in great detail on the extensive civilian harm that we witness daily: death, injury, destruction, hunger, disease, torture, other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment, repeated displacement on a large scale. We have described the deliberate obstruction of aid operations and the systematic dismantling of Palestinian life and that which sustains it in Gaza. So you have that information. And now the ICJ is considering whether a genocide is taking place in Gaza. It will weigh the testimony that we have shared, but it will be too late. Recognizing the urgency, the ICJ has indicated clear provisional measures that must be implemented now, yet they have not. Previous reviews of the UN's conduct in cases of large-scale violations of international human rights and humanitarian law, reports on Myanmar 2019, Sri Lanka 2012, Srebrenica, Rwanda, both in 1999, pointed to our collective failure to speak to the scale of violations while they were committed. So for those killed and those whose voices are silenced, what more evidence do you need now? Will you act decisively to prevent genocide and to ensure respect for international humanitarian law? Or will you say instead that we did all we could? Mr. President, this degradation of international law is corrosive and infectious. It is undermining decades of progress on rules to protect civilians from inhumanity and the violent and lawless among us who act with impunity. Humanity, the law, and reason must prevail. This council must prevail. Demand this ends. Stop arming it. Insist on accountability. To the Israeli authorities, stop killing and injuring civilians. Lift this brutal blockade. Let humanitarians save lives. To Hamas and other armed Palestinian groups, release all hostages immediately and unconditionally. Stop putting civilians at risk during military operations. And for those who will not survive what we fear is coming, in plain sight, it will be no consolation to know that future generations will hold us in this chamber to account. But they will. And if we have not seriously done all we could, then we should fear that judgment. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Fletcher for his briefing. I now give the floor to Ms. Angelica Jacom, please.
Thank you, President, members of the Security Council, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, I wish to thank the Greek presidency of the United Nations Security Council for inviting the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations to brief you on the item, the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question, specifically the food security situation in Gaza. Mr. President, the situation in Gaza is very difficult as millions of people face acute food insecurity and the risk of famine is imminent. The latest Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, IPC, analysis released just yesterday confirms that the entire population of the Gaza Strip, approximately 2.1 million people, remains at critical risk of famine following months of conflict, mass displacement, and severe constraints on humanitarian access. 500,000 people, 1 out of 5 people, are in IPC 5 category, defined as catastrophe. Essential items for people's survival are depleted or likely to be exhausted in the coming weeks. Compared to the previous IPC analysis released in October 2024, the situation has significantly deteriorated. Between the 1st of April and the 10th of May 2025, 93% of the population, or 1.95 million people, were classified in crisis or worse, IPC Phase 3 or above, of which 244,000 people, 12% of the population, are in IPC 5, catastrophe, and 925,000, 44%, in IPC Phase 4, emergency. While levels of acute malnutrition remain at alert and serious levels in North Gaza, Gaza City, and Rafah governorates, there is a deep concern that this could quickly worsen. In what is considered IPC's most likely scenario from 11 May to the end of September 2025, the whole Gaza Strip is classified in what the IPC, the whole Gaza Strip is classified emergency IPC Phase 4, with the entire population expected to face crisis or worse acute food insecurity. This includes 470,000 people, or 1 in 5 people, reaching catastrophe levels of food insecurity, IPC Phase 5. Over 1 million people, 54%, will face emergency IPC levels of hunger, and a remaining 500,000, 24%, will experience crisis or IPC levels of hunger. Should humanitarian and commercial blockades continue, the worst-case scenario could unfold, leading to near-complete lack of access to food, water, medicine, non-food items, supplies, and services that are essential for survival. Mr. President, children and women have not been spared in this crisis. Prior to the 7th October 2023, Gaza had low rates of malnutrition comparable to European countries due to a diverse and affordable food supply. It was self-sufficient in vegetables, eggs, milk, poultry, and fish, and produced much of its meat, olive oil, and fruits. Nearly 71% of children under the age of 5 are expected to be acutely malnourished over the next 11 months, from May 2025 to April 2026. Of these, 14,100 cases are expected to be severe. In addition, nearly 17,000 pregnant and breastfeeding women also require treatment for acute malnutrition during this period. Agri-food systems have collapsed in the Gaza Strip, while food prices have soared. Local food production, the primary source of a healthy diet, have been decimated. Nearly 75% of cropland, which contributed to up to 1/3 of daily consumption, has been damaged or destroyed since the escalation of hostilities. Animal production has been devastated, with almost 95% of cattle and more than half of sheep and goat herds now dead. And the prices of wheat flour has increased by 3,000% since February 2025. We are witnessing the systemic breakdown of conditions essential for survival. People in Gaza are not only experiencing lack of food, but they are going through a profound breakdown of health, livelihood, and social structures, leaving entire communities in a state of desperation, devastation, and death. The right to food is a basic human right, and this crisis is preventable. Food production kits, medicine, water, and hygiene kits are waiting to be delivered across the border. Mr. President, by the time famine has been declared, people are already dying of hunger with irreversible consequences that will last generations. The window of opportunity to deliver assistance is now. The United Nations Security Council Resolution 2417 reaffirms that protecting civilians and objects critical to preventing hunger is a shared responsibility. FAO stands ready to work with all partners. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. Jacom for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President.
And I'd like to start by thanking Under-Secretary General Fletcher and Director Jacom for briefing us today and not pulling your punches on stark detail. The UK called this meeting alongside Denmark, France, Greece and Slovenia in response to the alarming warnings that the humanitarian situation in Gaza is worse than it has ever been. So we're calling for 3 urgent things. First, the UK calls on Israel to lift its block on aid. The World Food Programme warned us over a week ago that they have no food left. And IPC data released yesterday shows that the whole of Gaza is at the risk of famine. Meanwhile, tons of food are currently sitting rotting at the border, blocked from reaching people who are starving. This is cruel and it is inexcusable, and it risks further deaths that should be avoidable. Second, the UK will not support any aid mechanism that seeks to deliver political or military objectives or puts vulnerable civilians at risk. We call on Israel to urgently engage with the UN to assure a return to delivery of aid in line with humanitarian principles. International law requires Israel to allow the rapid and unimpeded provision of humanitarian aid to all civilians. Third, the UK reiterates our outrage at the killing of Palestinian Red Crescent workers and the strikes on a UN ops compound in March. We are disappointed that Israel has not yet released the final findings of its investigation into the UN ops incident or taken concrete action to ensure these incidents can never happen again. President, the release of Eden Alexander yesterday, after 17 months of cruel Hamas captivity, offers a rare moment of hope. We must never forget the suffering of those hostages that remain in Gaza and those families awaiting the return of their loved ones' remains. It is ceasefire deals that have delivered the release of over 180 hostages and allowed a massive scale-up of aid for desperate Palestinians. This shows what is possible with political will. This is why we strongly oppose an expansion of this conflict, as do many hostages' families. And it is a ceasefire deal that now offers the best hope of ending the agony of the hostages and their families, alleviating the suffering of civilians in Gaza, ending Hamas control of Gaza, and achieving a pathway to a two-state solution. I thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of the United Kingdom for his statement. I now give the floor to the Permanent Representative of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur le Président, je remercie tout d'abord Monsieur Tom Fletcher, coordinateur des secours d'urgence, ainsi que Madame Angelica Jacom, directrice du bureau de la FAO à New York, pour leur présentation. La France salue le travail du BCH et de la FAO, ainsi que celui de tous les acteurs humanitaires œuvrant à Gaza pour conserver un semblant d'humanité et de solidarité dans une région plongée dans l'horreur. La France s'est associée à la demande de réunion avec ses 4 partenaires pour de puissantes raisons. Premièrement, la poursuite de bombardements par Israël contre les infrastructures et populations civiles qui touchent aussi les travailleurs humanitaires. Israël doit se conformer au droit international humanitaire qui exige que les civils soient protégés. Ce respect du droit vaut aussi pour les opérations conduites en Cisjordanie au bénéfice d'une politique de colonisation illégale. Deuxièmement, la libération des otages. Tous les otages aux mains du Hamas et d'autres groupes terroristes doivent être libérés immédiatement et sans condition. Leur calvaire insoutenable doit prendre fin pour qu'ils rejoignent leurs familles. Les lamentables mises en scène auxquelles nous avions assisté lors de précédentes libérations ne doivent pas se reproduire. Puisse la libération de Edan Alexandre être le début de la fin du calvaire pour tous les autres. Troisièmement, le blocage de toute entrée d'aide humanitaire depuis plus de 2 mois et son utilisation assumée comme moyen de pression dans la guerre en cours constituent une violation du droit international humanitaire. Les populations civiles de Gaza sont affamées et assoiffées. Nous appelons Israël à lever les entraves à l'acheminement de l'aide et au travail des humanitaires immédiatement et sans condition. Quatrièmement, nous nous opposons au mécanisme de distribution et de gestion de l'aide humanitaire proposé par Israël. Les modalités envisagées vont à l'encontre du droit international et ne permettraient pas de répondre aux besoins des populations. Nous réaffirmons notre soutien aux acteurs multilatéraux et humanitaires opérant à Gaza, en particulier les agences et programmes des Nations unies, au premier rang desquels l'UNRWA, ainsi que le Comité international de la Croix-Rouge, qui ont prouvé leur efficacité et leur fiabilité. Création d'hôpitaux de campagne, livraison d'aide alimentaire, soins médicaux, vaccination, protection et assistance, éducation, c'est leur mandat, qui leur a été confié par des conventions internationales, par des résolutions des Nations unies. C'est leur métier qu'ils exercent en toute humanité, indépendance, neutralité, impartialité. Il incombe à Israël de leur permettre d'opérer. Cinquièmement, la France condamne l'extension prévue des opérations israéliennes à Gaza et rappelle sa ferme opposition à tout projet d'occupation de territoire à Gaza et de déplacement de la population. Ces actions mèneraient à une impasse absolue. Ces violations graves du droit international ne contribueraient en rien à la sécurité d'Israël et mettraient en cause la stabilité de la région. La France demeure fermement opposée à toute forme d'annexion, qu'elle concerne la Cisjordanie ou Gaza. Monsieur le Président, dans ce contexte, l'urgence est double. Le cessez-le-feu doit être rétabli et le blocage de l'aide humanitaire levé. Le plan arabe de reconstruction doit être soutenu. Nous formons le vœu que le voyage en cours du président des États-Unis dans la région permette des progrès en ce sens. L'urgence, enfin, c'est de remettre la recherche d'une solution politique au premier plan. Seul un règlement politique global du conflit israélo-palestinien permettra aux Israéliens et aux Palestiniens de vivre côte à côte en paix et en sécurité. C'est dans la poursuite de cet objectif que l'Arabie saoudite et la France coprésideront une conférence internationale pour la mise en œuvre de la solution à 2 États ici à New York le mois prochain. L'objectif recherché est clair, rassembler la communauté internationale autour de propositions concrètes pour mettre en œuvre la solution des 2 États. C'est ainsi que nous parviendrons à garantir la sécurité d'Israël et son intégration régionale, tout en répondant à l'aspiration légitime des Palestiniens à disposer d'un État. Cela passe aussi par le désarmement du Hamas, la définition d'une gouvernance crédible dont il sera exclu et la réforme de l'autorité palestinienne. C'est un chemin ardu qui nécessite une forte volonté politique. La France continuera à se mobiliser en ce sens et appelle ce Conseil à se montrer à la hauteur de la responsabilité qui est la sienne. Je vous remercie.
I thank the Permanent Representative of France for his statement, and now I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me also thank USG Fletcher and Director Jacom for their somber and extremely concerning briefings. Denmark has called for this urgent meeting together with France, Greece, Slovenia and the UK due to the urgent humanitarian situation in Gaza. More than 2 months have passed since the complete humanitarian blockade of Gaza by Israel. Trucks loaded with life-saving assistance, including food, water and medicine, are waiting at the border crossings. Food is rotting at the border, while the people of Gaza are starving. Medicine and hospital supplies are held up, while the sick and wounded suffer and die from preventable and treatable diseases. The situation is the worst since the conflict started with Hamas terror attacks on October 7th. Yesterday, the IPC released its report on the food situation in Gaza. It shows a significant deterioration compared to the most recent analysis in October, and as we've heard, the entirety of Gaza is classified as IPC4 or emergency, and there's a high risk that famine will occur. This is deeply alarming, and we all have a responsibility to act. The catastrophic and deteriorating situation is coupled with the announcement of Israel to expand its military operations in Gaza. We strongly oppose these plans that risk having immense consequences in an already desperate humanitarian situation and displacing the majority of the civilian population. This does nothing to serve the long-term interests of peace and security in the region. At the same time, the Israeli government has announced plans to establish a new mechanism for aid delivery to Gaza under Israeli control, including Israeli military forces, as well as private contractors. The UN has decided not to participate in this modality, citing that it contradicts Israel's obligations under international humanitarian law and disregards the International Court of Justice provisional orders requiring unhindered provision of humanitarian assistance at scale to all civilians in need. Denmark supports the UN's position. Denmark will only support an aid mechanism that adheres to the humanitarian principles and is in line with international law. Humanitarian aid must never be politicized and used as a political bargaining chip or as a part of a military strategy. Such militarization is not only contrary to humanitarian principles and international humanitarian law, it sets a dangerous precedent for the future of humanitarian work in war zones around the world. As we've heard from the USG, the UN and their humanitarian partners already have an established aid system in place, ready to deliver desperately needed humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza. WFP reports that they alone have enough food to feed 1 million people for up to 4 months. These supplies are already positioned in aid corridors, ready to be brought in. The people of Gaza do not need a new aid mechanism. They need humanitarian aid to flow freely. Mr. President, we reiterate our strong condemnation of any attack on the UN and humanitarian workers. We recall that it is prohibited to attack civilians and civilian objects under international humanitarian law. Humanitarian personnel must be respected and protected. Full and transparent investigations into all such incidents are central to the efforts to avoid repetition, as well as imperative for assuring accountability. I also wish to underline our strong condemnation of Hamas and continue alarmed by the unspeakable suffering that the heinous terrorist attacks on October 7th have caused. The hostages held by Hamas have endured and continue to endure merciless treatment. This is completely unacceptable. We welcome the release of the American-Israeli hostage, who has finally been reunited with his loved ones after having been brutally held captive by Hamas. We reiterate our call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages and for Hamas to allow humanitarian access to them. To conclude, Mr. President, in the face of continued suffering, we call on all the parties to reach an immediate and lasting ceasefire, to end the bloodshed, and to save innocent life. I thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Denmark for her statement. I now give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I want to thank Director Jacom for her briefing, and I also want to thank USG Fletcher for his really powerful testimony. And I want to thank him for confronting us with our responsibility, or even more important, with our conscience. As Slovenia, we do keep asking ourselves, are we doing enough? And probably and obviously not. But we keep trying and we will continue to try. Mr. President, for 19 months, messages of the humanitarian community have echoed through the walls of this Council. Warnings, asks, pleas, and principles repeated time and again. Today, the consequences of ignoring these pleas are starkly visible. More than 15,000 children have died, each a tragic reminder of our collective failure. We fear that this war and absence of our decisive reaction to it could change the way wars are being fought in the future. So we clearly want to say wars have rules, and Gaza is no exception. Our calls today are simple. Number one, lift the blockade, and stop the starvation. 2 months into the absolute denial of humanitarian aid to the territory, stocks inside Gaza that keep the people alive are depleted. Stocks outside are waiting and going bad. Yesterday, the IPC partnership delivered an alarm with a sobering message. 2 million people are heading into famine. 500,000 are already starving right now as we speak. A rock bottom of humanity and dignity have been reached. Blocking aid kills. Starvation as a method of warfare is strictly prohibited under international humanitarian law and is codified as a war crime. Failing to agree on an immediate and sustained cessation of hostilities, an immediate resumption of humanitarian aid, will be measured in lives lost, systems collapsed, and people pushed beyond the brink. Number 2, respect humanitarian principles. Humanitarian action, including aid delivery, must be based on the established principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. These principles ensure effective and ethical delivery of aid in any conflict zone. They prevent humanitarian aid from being used as an instrument of war. We reject any model which does not meet the minimum bar from principled humanitarian support, including the one recently outlined by Israel. I want to state Slovenia's clear support to the aid distribution system established and carried out by the UN and its humanitarian partners, and in conformity with international humanitarian law. The long-established network of UN agencies and NGOs, including UNRWA and WFP and others, must remain the backbone of the response. Number 3, spare lives that save lives. We are appalled by the recent attacks on humanitarian workers whose sole mission is to deliver life-saving assistance. This encompasses the attack on an aid ship outside the territorial waters of Malta. United Nations, including UNRWA, and all humanitarian workers must be allowed to carry out their work in a safe and secure manner. This is simply paramount for every single humanitarian action, among others the polio vaccination campaign, which has been postponed despite crucial needs. The number of incidents leading to deaths and serious injuries of humanitarian workers is unacceptable. We call for their protection and for accountability for all past incidents. As Assistant Secretary General Msuya, in front of this very audience, rightly said recently, there is no lack of legal protection for humanitarian workers, but there is lack of political will. Mr. President, Slovenia is convinced that further military escalation in Gaza would only exacerbate an already catastrophic situation for the civilian Palestinian population and threaten the lives of the hostages that remain in captivity. The notion of humanity in Gaza is being crushed before our eyes. Our final plea is the one we have been repeating consistently. It is the beginning to an end to the suffering of the people in Gaza, including those taken hostage. It is never too late to change the course, to end this stain on our humanity and dignity. This war must end. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Slovenia for his statement, and now I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. بداية نود أن نعرب عن عميق شكرنا للسيد توم فليتشر والسيدة أنجيليكا جيكوم على إحاطتيهما الوافيتين. إحاطتان رسمتا صورة واضحة جلية لوضع لم يعد يحتمل مزيدا من الصمت أو غض الطرف. بعدما يقارب 19 شهرا من عدوان متوحش وغاشم على شعب أعزل، وبعد أكثر من 70 يوما من حصار خانق على غزة، لا نقف أمام مجرد أزمة عابرة، بل أمام مأساة إنسانية بحجم العار الأخلاقي الذي سيبقى يلاحق جميع المشاركين فيها والمتواطئين معها، بل حتى الصامتين عنها. سيد الرئيس، اليوم الشيء الوحيد الذي يسمح له بالدخول إلى غزة هو الموت. القنابل والرصاص تمر للقطاع، بينما يمنع الحليب عن أفواه الرضع. يحظر الماء ويمنع الدواء وتغلق المعابر في وجه الحياة. يترك الأطفال بكل براءتهم وحدهم ليواجهوا شبح الجوع ونار الحصار. أهل غزة محرومون من كل شيء إلا من الموت والخوف، ومن مشاهدة بيوتهم تنهار وأجسادهم الهزيلة تذوب في مشهد يعري البشرية من إنسانيتها ويكشف عن وجه بشع لعالم يبدو أنه قد اعتاد النظر إلى الكارثة الواقعة أمام أنظارنا دون أن يرف له جفن. وكأن صور الآباء والأمهات يجمعون أشلاء بناتهم وأبنائهم التي مزقتها صواريخ وقنابل المحتل الإسرائيلي، وكأنها صور لا معنى لها. نحن اليوم أمام انهيار مدون لمنظومة القيم التي توهمنا حتى وقت قريب أنها تجمعنا. نحن أمام مفترق طرق تتنازع فيه الأخلاق والمصالح، حيث وللأسف يعامل الفلسطيني ككائن زائد عن الحاجة بلا حق في الحياة أو الأمل أو الكرامة. كيف لا والمحتل يصف سكان غزة بأنهم حيوانات بشرية ويعاملهم من هذا المنطلق، بل إن الحيوانات في عوالم أخرى تلقى من الرحمة والحقوق ما لم يمنح لهؤلاء العزل المحاصرين في وطنهم. سيد الرئيس، إننا نشهد في بث حي وعلى مرأى من الجميع جريمة تجويع ممنهجة يرتكبها المحتل الإسرائيلي ضد أكثر من 2,000,000 فلسطيني. جريمة واضحة المعالم ومكتملة الأركان، والمتهم فيها معلوم ومدان. جميع المنظمات الإنسانية ومن تبقى من أصحاب الضمير الحي في ظرف طغى عليه قانون الغاب يندد بهذه الجريمة ويدعو لإنهائها فوراً ومحاسبة المتورطين فيها. المدير العام لمنظمة الصحة العالمية صرح وأقتبس: لا نحتاج إعلاناً رسمياً للمجاعة كي نعلم أن الناس يتضورون جوعاً، وأن الدواء والطعام على بعد دقائق محجوبان بحكم الحصار. لكن ومع الأسف اللامبالاة بل التواطؤ أصبح عنواناً للمشهد، وكأن التعود على معاناة الفلسطينيين هو ما ينتظر منا. العائلات تقصف، الأطفال يحرقون، والناس لا يجوعون فقط بل يتركون ليموتوا ببطء، بينما العالم يدون المأساة ثم يطوي الصفحة. والنتيجة موجة الموت لا تميز بين رضيع وشيخ، الجميع تحت مقصلة الجوع والمرض واليأس. في أسبوع واحد قضى 14 مسناً في غزة جوعاً. منذ 2 مارس 2025 قضى 57 طفلاً بفعل سوء التغذية، والرقم على فداحته ليس سوى البداية في ظل النقص الحاد في الغذاء وانهيار المنظومة الصحية ومنظومة العمل الإنساني. حيث تحذر المنظمات الإنسانية من أن أكثر من 93% من أطفال غزة، أي 930 ألف طفل، معرضون لخطر المجاعة. في الوقت الذي تحل الكارثة على رؤوس الغزيين هناك أكثر من 3,000 شاحنة و116 ألف طن متري من المواد الغذائية على أهبة الاستعداد للدخول إلى غزة لتوزع على البطون الجائعة هناك، تنتظر فقط إذنا بالدخول. القوة المحتلة إسرائيل وحدها تعرقل هذا الوصول في خرق صارخ للقانون الدولي وفي انتهاك مباشر لأوامر محكمة العدل الدولية الملزمة. وبعد أن ضيقت على المنظمات الإنسانية، لا سيما الأونروا العمود الفقري للعمل الإنساني بغزة، راحت القوة المحتلة تروج لمخطط سمي زورا إنسانيا يعد على أهل غزة حريراتهم بعد أن عدت عليهم آلة الحصار والقتل الإسرائيلية أنفاسهم. خطة مرفوضة مثلما أعلنت الأمم المتحدة والمنظمات الإنسانية، وهي لا ترقى إلى مستوى الاحتياجات العاجلة والأساسية لأكثر من 2 مليون إنسان، وتبتعد كل البعد عن مبادئ الإنسانية والحياد والاستقلال والكرامة. سيد الرئيس، إنها كارثة من صنع البشر ومن صنع العجز الذي أضحى يشل منظومة العمل المتعدد الأطراف. لدينا الغذاء ولدينا القدرة على العلاج، ما ينقصنا هو الإرادة وفرض سيادة القانون. نحن لسنا أمام نقص في الإمدادات، بل نقص في الإنسانية. العائلات في غزة تجبر على أكل علف الحيوانات وعلى غلي أوراق الشجر إذا كان هناك ما تبقى من شجر، وعلى ما لا يحتمل من وسائل البقاء. إنها ليست أزمة موارد، بل أزمة ضمير. إن الآن لهذا المجلس الذي أوكلت إليه مسؤولية صون السلم والأمن الدوليين أن يسمع صرخة غزة وهي تختنق تحت الركام، وأن ينصت لنداء الإنسانية وقد أعياها صمته. لم يعد ممكنا أن يقف العالم متفرجا على شعب يباد بصمت ويحاصر بالخذلان ويجرد من أبسط حقوقه في الحياة. نطالب بوقف دائم وشامل لهذا العدوان الظالم، برفع الحصار عن أهلنا في غزة، بفتح المعابر أمام المساعدات الإنسانية، وبوقف كل أشكال التهجير القسري. إن الشعب الفلسطيني يريد وطنا وكرامة، يريد سلاما لا مشروطا ولا مجزوءا، بل سلاما عادلا ودائما. يريد دولة مستقلة على أرض تسمى فلسطين وعاصمتها القدس الشريف. وشكرا.
I thank the representative of Algeria for his statement, and now I give the floor to the permanent representative of Panama.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente, por convocar esta importante sesión informativa. Panamá agradece también al señor Tom Fletcher, secretario general adjunto de Asuntos Humanitarios y coordinador del Socorro de Emergencia, y a la señora Angelica Jacom, directora de la Oficina de la Organización de las Naciones Unidas para la Alimentación y Agricultura, FAO, en Nueva York, compatriota panameña a quien extendemos un muy especial saludo. A ambos agradecemos sus conmovedoras exposiciones. Panamá admira la incansable labor que realizan las agencias del Sistema de las Naciones Unidas en medio de una de las crisis humanitarias más desgarradoras de nuestro tiempo. Panamá reitera su llamado a establecer un alto al fuego inmediato y sostenido en la Franja de Gaza, que permita detener el sufrimiento humano, facilitar el acceso seguro de la ayuda humanitaria y la liberación incondicional de los rehenes. Estas medidas son urgentes, indispensables y posibles, como demostraron los días en que la tregua temporal permitió avances concretos. No podemos ignorar que gran parte del sufrimiento que vive actualmente la población palestina en Gaza tiene su origen en las decisiones y acciones extremistas realizadas por Hamás, que han desencadenado y prolongado este trágico conflicto, como lo fue la toma de rehenes, actos que Panamá ha condenado desde el primer momento y que por su premeditación y crueldad humana, como la demostrada en aquel fatídico octubre, han desatado consecuencias devastadoras. La reciente liberación del ciudadano Ethan Alexander, tras conversaciones impulsadas por la mediación de actores clave y bajo el acompañamiento del Comité Internacional de la Cruz Roja, representa un pequeño pero significativo avance en medio de una tragedia mayor que sigue adelante. Sin embargo, aún permanecen retenidas en Gaza 58 personas, de las cuales se estima que al menos 20 siguen con vida. Reiteramos nuestra exigencia de que todas las personas que aún permanecen retenidas en Gaza sean liberadas de forma inmediata, segura e incondicional. Expresamos nuestra solidaridad con sus familias, que viven marcadas por el dolor y la incertidumbre. Ninguna causa justifica la privación de libertad ni el sufrimiento deliberado de personas inocentes. Las razones que sustentan este llamado saltan a la vista. La información más reciente de las agencias humanitarias es contundente. Casi 2 millones de personas en Gaza viven bajo condiciones de inseguridad alimentaria severa y cerca de medio millón, la mayoría de ellos niños y mujeres, corren el riesgo inminente de morir de hambre si no se permite el acceso sostenido de la vital ayuda humanitaria. A esto se suma que el Programa Mundial de Alimentos advierte que las reservas de suministros vitales se han agotado debido al cierre prolongado de los cruces fronterizos. OCHA estima que más de 1.9 millones de personas han sido desplazadas. Las condiciones mínimas para la vida están desapareciendo, con consecuencias devastadoras, especialmente para los más vulnerables, niños, mujeres y adultos mayores. Panamá toma nota del llamado urgente de la FAO, que ha advertido que la agricultura en Gaza está al borde del colapso social. El acceso inmediato, sostenido y a gran escala de ayuda humanitaria es esencial, no solo para evitar más muertes por inanición, sino por preservar la salud pública, prevenir brotes epidémicos y proteger el derecho humano a la alimentación. Instamos, frente a esta situación extrema, que se tomen medidas urgentes para evitar una catástrofe aún mayor. Presidente, este Consejo analiza cifras, reportes y evaluaciones con la regularidad que mandata su función. No podemos perder de vista que detrás de cada estadística hay vidas quebradas por el hambre, el desplazamiento, el extremismo y la prolongación de un conflicto sin soluciones políticas visibles. Y detrás de cada esfuerzo por sostener esas vidas están quienes, con profundo compromiso humanitario, asumen riesgos extremos para asistirlas. Cientos de trabajadores humanitarios han perdido la vida desde el inicio del conflicto, mientras cumplían su deber de asistir a la población civil. Panamá reconoce la entrega y el coraje de quienes a nombre de la humanidad siguen ofreciendo atención médica, distribuyendo alimentos y apoyando moralmente a personas desplazadas en medio del caos de la guerra. Protegerlos no es solo un deber moral, es una responsabilidad jurídica de todas las partes en todo momento. Del mismo modo, toda respuesta humanitaria debe ser adecuadamente ejecutada y debe regirse por los principios de humanidad, neutralidad, imparcialidad e independencia. Ninguna circunstancia debe impedir que la ayuda llegue de manera efectiva a quienes la necesitan, ni comprometer la integridad del trabajo humanitario. Panamá subraya que las instalaciones que operan bajo la bandera de las Naciones Unidas deben ser respetadas sin excepción y recuerda que su ataque constituye una grave violación a las normas internacionales que rigen los conflictos armados. Panamá también advierte sobre los riesgos asociados al uso indebido de estas instalaciones para fines ajenos a su mandato humanitario, lo que pondría en peligro a civiles y comprometería la neutralidad del espacio humanitario. Presidente, en momentos como este, preservar la confianza en las instituciones humanitarias y garantizar su labor es esencial para salvar vidas. Loable propósito este que debe ser el de principal y el de mayor prioridad, porque frente a la destrucción y la desesperanza, el compromiso humanitario representa no solo un alivio, sino una afirmación concreta de que la comunidad internacional no ha renunciado a su deber moral ni a su humanidad. Muchas gracias.
I thank the permanent representative of Panama for his statement. I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Guyana.
Mr. President, I thank you for convening today's briefing. I also express my gratitude to USG Fletcher for his pellucid and indeed profound presentation, and Director Jacom for the invaluable information provided. Mr. President, the catastrophic situation in Gaza continues to be compounded by several worrying developments, of which I highlight the following. First, the latest IPC report underlines the critical risk of famine, which confronts the population in the Gaza Strip. The factors directly elevating this risk were identified as a protracted and large-scale military operation and continuation of the humanitarian and commercial blockade. These are both man-made factors, subject to the decision and control of the occupying power. Guyana has also taken note that the findings reflected in the IPC report mark a significant deterioration from previous IPC analyses. The state of food insecurity continues to decline rapidly in Gaza, with North Gaza and Rafah governorates projected to reach emergency levels of acute malnutrition between now and September. The Security Council cannot allow hundreds of thousands of civilians, including babies, to simply starve and waste away, while food, medicine, and other essentials for their survival sit in trucks, rotting and expiring. This misery is compounded as a third of UN-supported community kitchens have recently shut down due to the depletion of food supplies and limited access to fuel. Guyana calls on Israel to comply with its obligations under international humanitarian law, not to deprive the civilian population of the items indispensable for their survival. We further stress that the use of starvation as a weapon of warfare is a war crime. Guyana also stresses that aid must not be weaponized. Second, Guyana remains deeply concerned about the shrinking and extremely dangerous space in which aid workers and other humanitarian personnel are forced to operate in the Gaza Strip. With the lack of fully functioning coordination and deconfliction mechanisms, aid workers and other humanitarian personnel are forced to operate at great personal risk. Aid workers and other humanitarian personnel are guaranteed special protections under international law, and parties to a conflict are obligated to ensure their safety. We therefore condemn all direct attacks on aid workers and humanitarian personnel and call for full accountability for lives lost and injuries suffered on account of such attacks. We also call on all parties, including the occupying power, to strictly abide by their legal obligations regarding the protection of aid workers and humanitarian personnel. In this context, Guyana has taken note of the modality proposed by Israel for the distribution of aid in Gaza. The proposal entails replacing the existing aid distribution system run by the United Nations and its humanitarian partners and delivering supplies through Israeli hubs on the conditions set by the Israeli military. We have taken note of the response to this proposal by the humanitarian country team of the occupied Palestinian territory, particularly their observation that, and I quote, "it contravenes fundamental humanitarian principles and appears designed to reinforce control over life-sustaining items as a pressure tactic, as part of a military strategy. It is dangerous, driving civilians into militarized zones to collect rations, threatening lives, including those of humanitarian workers, while further entrenching forced displacement," unquote. We have also noted that UN Secretary General and USG Fletcher have both emphasized that the proposed modality fails to meet the minimum standards for principled humanitarian action, and that the UN will not participate in any arrangement that does not fully respect humanitarian principles. Guyana stresses that the international community must not allow established international legal norms and standards governing humanitarian assistance to civilians in conflict situations to be upended by proposals which do not satisfy humanitarian principles and which will further violate the dignity of civilians. Mr. President, the third issue I wish to highlight concerns the continuing forcible displacement of civilians in Gaza. We are deeply concerned by the reported approval on 5th May by Israeli Security Cabinet of a plan to expand military operations in the Gaza Strip and to concomitantly move most of the population to the southern part of the Strip, where the Israeli military would retain a presence. According to the Israeli Army spokesperson, the Rafah model will be replicated in other parts of the Strip. The observations by the UN Human Rights High Commissioner in response to Israel's announcement are instructive. The High Commissioner noted that Israel's reported plans, and I quote, further aggravate concerns that Israel's actions are aimed at inflicting on Palestinians conditions of life increasingly incompatible with their continued existence in Gaza as a group, unquote. On this note, Guyana recalls the pronouncements of the International Court of Justice on the displacement of the Palestinian people by Israel and calls on Israel to adhere to its obligations. Mr. President, allow me to also reiterate Guyana's deep concern about the situation in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, where the Israeli military operation in northern West Bank is still ongoing. The demolitions of Palestinian property, forced closure of UNRWA schools, and harassment of UNRWA teachers, expansion of settlements, and other illegalities are serious violations of the rights of the Palestinian people, which must not remain unaddressed. I conclude with the following appeals. We need to immediately return to a ceasefire in Gaza as the first crucial step to saving civilian lives. There must be an immediate and unconditional lifting of the aid blockade on Gaza, which has been imposed since 2nd of March. Palestinians cannot simply be condemned to a fate of starvation, malnutrition, and disease in the interest of advancing military objectives. All remaining hostages must be released, and all Palestinians detained in Israeli prisons without charge must also be freed. The recent release of Israeli-American hostage Edan Alexander is a welcome move. Guyana stresses that the taking of hostages is a war crime, and their release should not be transactional. Guyana reiterates its appeal for the protection of aid workers, humanitarian and UN personnel, including staffers from agencies such as UNRWA. Guyana calls on Israel to halt its military operations in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and to halt all activities that are causing great suffering and hardships for the civilian population. Finally, Guyana appeals for real peace to be given a chance in the Middle East. That peace is premised on a resolution of the Palestinian conflict in line with the two-state solution based on the pre-1967 borders. Anything short of this will only perpetuate the cycle of violence and pain at the heart of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Our sincere hope is that all member states will use the upcoming June conference to achieve concrete outcomes for resolving the Palestinian question. I thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Guyana for her statement. And now I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. We would like to begin by paying tribute to the extraordinary courage of UN personnel and humanitarian workers who are operating under harrowing conditions in Gaza. Let me thank Madam Jacom for her briefing. We also thank Under-Secretary General Tom Fletcher for his sobering and deeply troubling briefing. This briefing, the statement of Mr. Fletcher, and we must commend him for this, for what he has said, because it could not have been said in more clearer terms. Because it is not just sobering, it is an indictment of the occupying power, its continuing illegal policies and actions of its war crimes and crimes against humanity, of the genocide in process, all with complete impunity and persistent and blatant violations of international law. You rightly said, Mr. Fletcher, that it must be a moment of reflection for this Council, for all of us, whether we shall continue to see this, all of this, happen before our eyes, or will we act urgently and decisively to stop this atrocity. Mr. President, as we convene once again, the suffering of Gaza's people continues unabated. The humanitarian tragedy has reached catastrophic proportions. What we are witnessing is not incidental. It is the systematic destruction of a civilian population, the deliberate use of starvation, the relentless siege, and the targeted and methodical dismantling of humanitarian architecture. This is something that Israel, the occupying power, is doing deliberately and unashamedly, as Mr. Fletcher has put it. After more than 10 weeks of total blockade, indiscriminate bombardment from the air, land, and sea, and an escalation of ground operations, Gaza lies in ruins. Over 2 million people, half of them children, are enduring the unendurable. Aid is blocked, hospitals have collapsed, and families are trapped amid rubble and despair. Famine is no longer looming, it is present. 1 in every 3 children under 2 years of age is acutely malnourished. The Integrated Food Security Phase Classification snapshot released yesterday by WFP presents a grim reality. 470,000 people in Gaza are facing catastrophic hunger, and the entire population is experiencing acute food insecurity. The WFP is exhausted its last food stocks to support hot meals kitchens for families on 25th of April. All 25 WFP-supported bakeries have been shut down as wheat flour and cooking fuel have run out. Over 71,000 children and 17,000 mothers urgently require treatment for acute malnutrition, and 60,000 children need immediate medical care. Attacks on hospitals, aid convoys, humanitarian workers, and UN staff, including the killing of 290 UNRWA personnel, are not isolated violations. They form a pattern of targeted attacks that has dangerously eroded the protection afforded under international humanitarian law. Mr. President, the Geneva Conventions and the binding Security Council resolutions are clear. Resolutions 2175, 2286, and 2730, as well as Articles 18, 23, 33, and 59 of the Fourth Geneva Convention explicitly prohibit starvation of civilians, attacks on medical facilities, obstruction of humanitarian aid, and collective punishment. Yet, we are witnessing the inverse. The politicization and militarization of aid, the weaponization of starvation, and the systematic destruction of humanitarian lifelines. The so-called militarized aid coordination mechanism, which would reduce humanitarian access points from 400 to merely 5 tightly controlled hubs near military installations, undermines and violates the core humanitarian principles of neutrality and impartiality. It risks transforming humanitarian aid into an instrument of coercion and forced displacement. This must be unequivocally rejected. It is totally unacceptable. The humanitarian country team of the occupied Palestinian territory, which brings together around 15 UN entities and over 200 NGOs, has categorically denounced plans by Israeli officials to dismantle the existing aid distribution system, affirming that it contravenes fundamental humanitarian principles and appears designed to reinforce control over life-sustaining items as a pressure tactic as part of a military strategy. Mr. President, I would like to emphasize 4 urgent imperatives here. First, there must be a permanent and unconditional ceasefire. Resolution 2735 must be implemented in full across the occupied Palestinian territory, including the West Bank. Ceasefire is not just a precondition for aid, it is a precondition for life. Second, the blockade imposed since 2nd of March must be lifted. Humanitarian access is not a favor. It is a legal obligation. Aid convoys and medical teams must be protected and allowed to operate freely and safely. The normalization of starvation as a weapon of war is a crime. Collective punishment must end, and there must be accountability. The Gaza reconstruction plan must be fully and actively supported, and no forced displacement of Gazans must be tolerated. Third, UNRWA must be allowed to operate without obstruction. Its forced exclusion violates both the neutrality of humanitarian assistance and the provisions of international humanitarian law, as well as multiple UN resolutions. Fourth, this Council must address the root cause, the prolonged occupation of Palestinian territory. The humanitarian crisis is a symptom of symptomatic political injustice. The only viable peace, the path to peace, lies in a just resolution of the Palestinian question based on the two-state solution along the pre-1967 borders, with Al-Quds al-Sharif as the capital of a sovereign and independent Palestinian state. In this regard, Pakistan supports the upcoming June conference to be co-chaired by France and Saudi Arabia. This conference must yield a credible, time-bound roadmap for Palestinian statehood, the protection of holy sites, and reversal of illegal settlement activity. Mr. President, the people of Gaza have endured unimaginable suffering. They deserve to live in peace, with dignity, and to exercise their inalienable right to self-determination. This Council must rise to its responsibility to uphold its own resolutions, to end the occupation, and act with urgency to bring the long-awaited justice to the people of Palestine. The entire world is watching. The Palestinian people are watching. The children, the babies, deprived of food and safety, might be wondering what is happening around them. Who was supposed to come to their rescue? We, this Council, and those most responsible are being judged and will be judged in posterity. Let us come together and act united in the interest of peace and for the sake of humanity. I thank you.
I thank the Parliament representative of Pakistan for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Undersecretary Fletcher and Director Jacom, for your briefings. Colleagues, the United States is committed to bringing hostages home. We welcome that New Jersey resident Edan Alexander is finally returning home as a result of President Trump's efforts and Israel's military pressure on Hamas. Hamas continues to prolong this horrific conflict by refusing to lay down its arms and releasing the remaining hostages. Hamas bears sole responsibility for the war it unleashed on October 7th, 2023, and for the recent resumption of hostilities. The terrorist group has rejected numerous proposals put forward by the United States, Qatar, and Egypt that would release the remaining 58 hostages who have now been cruelly held for 584 days and bring calm to Gaza. Had Hamas agreed to proposals put forward and accepted by Israel, there could have been a new ceasefire weeks ago. This conflict could end tomorrow if Hamas released the hostages, laid down its arms, and left Gaza forever. Its reckless decisions have caused enough bloodshed. Hamas must now return all living and deceased hostages without further delay, including the bodies of Americans, Itay Chen, Gadi Hagi, Judy Weinstein Hagi, and Omer Nutra. They will not be left behind. They will not be forgotten. Every day, Hamas demonstrates its lack of regard for Palestinians it purports to represent in Gaza. Its use of civilians as human shields is deplorable as a violation of international humanitarian law. The Security Council needs to apply pressure on Hamas to free Palestinians from Hamas's tyranny. Shielding Hamas from accountability undermines Israel's security and does nothing to improve the lives of Palestinians. The United States supports Israel in its right to defend itself from groups that have attacked it. We recognize the steps Israel has taken to avoid inadvertent civilian casualties when targeting terrorists, and we stand unequivocally for the protection of civilian lives during armed conflict. No one wants to see Palestinian civilians in Gaza go hungry and thirsty. Mr. President, the United States supports getting assistance to non-combatants in Gaza in a way that does not allow Hamas to benefit. For weeks, members of this council have been calling for a resumption in the flow of humanitarian aid to Gaza. Colleagues, there is now a means through which this can be done. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is an independent entity that has been established to provide a secure mechanism capable of delivering aid directly to those in need without Hamas stealing, looting,
or leveraging this assistance for its own ends. Safeguards are in place to ensure Palestinian civilians in Gaza will have access to aid, preventing diversion by Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and criminal organizations, and ensuring that Israel can remain secure. In March, this council heard the powerful testimony of freed hostage Eli Sharabi, who shared that he personally witnessed his Hamas captors carry dozens and dozens of boxes of aid marked with UN and UNRWA emblems into the tunnel where he was held hostage. This is unacceptable behavior, and it began before October 7th, 2023. It's time we tried a real solution that will ensure assistance goes to the civilians it was meant for, not Hamas. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation's plan provides a means for doing so. The United States has sent senior members of the administration to Israel to work on modalities. While some humanitarian organizations may ultimately choose not to engage in these conversations, others have chosen a more constructive path, and they will be able to deliver aid in an appropriate way, hopefully very soon. We appreciate their willingness to discuss their questions and concerns and work through any challenges. We call upon the United Nations, humanitarian organizations, and the international community to work with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation in providing assistance to civilians. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation has expressed a commitment to deliver aid consistent with the humanitarian principles of impartiality, neutrality, independence, and humanity. Indeed, the Foundation has stated these values are not abstract. They shape every decision we make and every action we take. Like all aid organizations, the Foundation is allowed to ensure its own security so that commodities reach civilians in need. Over the course of this war, we have seen deeply disappointing and disturbing instances of humanitarian and international organizations compromised by Hamas terrorists. There is no high road in opposing this plan, which will allow the safe and secure delivery of large amounts of aid directly to those who need it, while preventing diversion by terrorists and criminals. We therefore urge the United Nations to continue discussions to which USG Fletcher referred, to explore a way forward to help those in desperate need of humanitarian assistance. Anyone serious about restoring the flow of aid should support this important effort. Mr. President, the region ultimately has a choice. It can continue to allow Iran and its proxies, such as Hamas, to dictate the region's future, or it can instead choose a path forward toward a more prosperous future for all its people. We can start by meeting the immediate humanitarian needs of those who have suffered during this conflict by supporting a new way of delivering aid. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement. I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Somalia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Somalia welcomes the convening of this urgent meeting on the humanitarian situation and the protection of aid workers in Gaza. We thank USG Mr. Tom Fletcher and Ms. Angelica Jacom, Director of FAO Office in New York, for the sobering briefings. My delegation is gravely alarmed by the worsening humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. The continued Israeli military campaign, in a blatant disregard of international law and the Council's repeated calls, has inflicted unimaginable suffering on civilians. The siege of Gaza, particularly in its northern areas, have brought the population to the brink of famine and starvation. Starvation is now being used as a method of warfare. Children, women, and elderly are being deprived of life-saving food, water, and medicine. Somalia strongly rejects the proposal reportedly put forward by Israel to impose a unilateral mechanism for the distribution of aid to Gaza. Such an approach contravenes the principles of humanitarian neutrality and impartiality and undermines the role of United Nations and its agencies and violates the binding provisional measures issued by the International Court of Justice. Humanitarian assistance must never be politicized. Mr. President, we are deeply disturbed by the scale of attack on humanitarian personnel. According to UN OCHA, at least 273 aid workers have been killed since the start of the hostilities, the highest number ever recorded in any conflict. This includes doctors, nurses, first responders, and the UN staff. The targeting of humanitarian workers and medical facilities constitute a grave breach of international humanitarian law, and those responsible must be held fully accountable. Somalia calls for an immediate, safe, and unhindered entry of humanitarian aid through all crossings, including Rafah and Kerem Shalom. Israel, as an occupying power, must meet its obligation under the international law and facilitate the delivery of humanitarian assistance to all areas of Gaza. We are also deeply concerned by the escalation of the punitive measures targeting UNRWA, and we condemn the suspension of the funding and obstruction of its operations. These actions represent an assault on the rights of the Palestinian refugee and violate the mandate given UNRWA by the General Assembly. My delegation reaffirms its unwavering support for the agency's indispensable work. Any attempt to forcibly displace Palestinians from Gaza or elsewhere in occupied Palestinian territory must be categorically rejected. The right of return and compensation of the Palestinian refugee remains non-negotiable and must be upheld in accordance with the relevant United Nations resolutions. My delegation condemns ongoing Israeli efforts to expand illegal settlements, expropriate land, and alter the demographic compositions of occupied Palestinian territory. The escalation of military incursions and settler violence with the help of IDF represents a blatant violation of international law and further destabilizes the region. We underscore the need to respect the historic and legal status quo of Jerusalem and reaffirm the custodial role of Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan in safeguarding the religious sites in the city. Mr. President, Security Council must shoulder its responsibility to maintain international peace and security. We call for an immediate and comprehensive ceasefire, an end to the blockade, and safe release of all detainees and restoration of full humanitarian access to all parts of Gaza. Somalia supports the convening of the upcoming International Peace Conference in June, co-sponsored by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and France, as a critical step toward reviving a meaningful political process. We urge all parties to support this initiative and ensure that it leads to a tangible progress toward just and lasting solution. On that secures the full realization of the rights of Palestinian people and the stabilization of an independent, sovereign state of Palestine with Al-Quds Sharif as its capital, in line with international law and relevant United Nations resolutions. I thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Somalia for his statement, and now I give the floor to a Permanent Representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank USG Tom Fletcher and the Director Jacom of the FAO office in New York for their sobering briefings. I also thank Denmark, France, Greece, Slovenia, and the UK for calling for this urgent meeting amid the heightened concern over the catastrophic situation in Gaza. Mr. President, we are deeply alarmed by the unfathomable suffering and hunger that civilians in Gaza are enduring. Since March, not a single truck or grain of flour has entered Gaza. Every day we witness harrowing photos of bone-emaciated children. It stains our common moral conscience to witness such images in 2025. The United Nations, as well as the members of the Security Council, including the Republic of Korea, have clearly reiterated that Israel has the obligation as the occupying power to ensure the requisite provision of food and medical supplies to the Palestinian population in Gaza, as detailed in Article 55 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. We also would like to stress the escalating outcries of humanitarian agencies, including the United Nations, describing the apocalyptic situation in Gaza. Just yesterday, as today's briefers mentioned, the UN-backed IPC report pointed out that the entire population in Gaza is facing high levels of acute food insecurity, with 500,000 people facing starvation. We are also concerned by the recent Israeli proposal for a new modality of Gaza aid distribution, according to which only 68 trucks per day will be allowed to enter Gaza, and the weak and injured Palestinian civilians will be required to move long distances to militarized aid hubs to receive limited amounts of essential items. Mr. President, when it began its military response to the horrible terrorist attacks by Hamas on October 7th, Israel claimed it was fighting against Hamas, not against civilians. However, the undeniable fact is that women and children account for well over half of the more than 50,000 fatalities. Thus, we once again urge Israel to protect civilians and humanitarian aid workers, and to immediately lift its harsh blockade, allowing the unimpeded flow of aid throughout Gaza. And we take this opportunity to express our support for the tireless and selfless efforts of key humanitarian agencies, including UNRWA, working on the ground in the most unforgiving conditions. Meanwhile, we reiterate our demand for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas. In this regard, we highly commend the U.S. efforts to secure the negotiated release of additional hostages. We wholeheartedly welcome the release of Israeli-American Idan Alexander, which was realized through tireless negotiations rather than renewed hostilities. As the U.S. President announced, we hope this can be the first step necessary to finally bring the brutal conflict in Gaza to an end. Mr. President, unfortunately, our concern does not stop at the border of Gaza. The unrelenting instability and violence in the West Bank, along with the ongoing settlement expansion, represent another source of fear in the region. The hostilities in the wider region, including in Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen, have not ceased either. Amid the compounding humanitarian situations in these areas are pushing communities to the brink. However, we are also encountering some glimmers of hope for enhanced regional dialogue and peace. The timely agreement between the U.S. and the Houthis to stop mutual hostilities, as well as the indirect talks between Israel and Syria, and ongoing U.S. negotiations with Iran in Oman, are all demonstrating that even in this period of heated violence, dialogue is indeed possible and desperately needed to build long overdue peace. We therefore encourage all parties in the region to stay committed to diplomacy, not only for a renewed Gaza ceasefire deal, but also for a better future for the region. Mr. President, the vast majority of the international community remains strongly committed to the two-state solution. Taking into account the upcoming high-level conference co-chaired by France and Saudi Arabia in June, the Republic of Korea sincerely hopes that the peace process to realize the two-state solution can soon be reinvigorated. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Permanent Representative of the Republic of Korea for his statement, and now give the floor to the Permanent Representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель, Благодарим заместителя генерального секретаря ООН по гуманитарным вопросам Тома Флетчера и директора отделения ФАО в Нью-Йорке Анхелику Жакома за их откровенные трагические брифинги о деградирующей с каждым днем обстановке в секторе Газа. Сегодня мы вынуждены в очередной раз говорить о ситуации, которую невозможно назвать иначе, как гуманитарной катастрофой. Уже 10 недель Газа находится под жестокой блокадой, возобновленной израильскими властями. Миллионы жителей анклава лишены элементарного продовольствия, воды и медицинской помощи. Высокими темпами распространяется голод, о чем сегодня уже говорилось в свете опубликованных вчера соответствующих статистических данных. Мы на ежедневной основе получаем тревожные сообщения о том, что запасы товаров первой необходимости в секторе почти исчерпаны, медицинские учреждения и гуманитарные центры прекращают свою работу, закрываются последние хлебопекарни. При этом десятки гуманитарных фур с тоннами продовольствия, медикаментов и топлива простаивают на границе. Доступ в анклав им закрыт властями Израиля. Коллеги, мы все должны ясно осознавать, что каждая минута промедления, каждый день блокады – это новые потерянные жизни. Это дети, страдающие и умирающие от недоедания. Это семьи, вынужденные выживать среди руин под открытым небом. Это врачи и гуманитарные работники из последних сил, борющиеся за спасение жизней, не имея при этом необходимых ресурсов. Вместо того, чтобы проявить политическую волю и открыть погранпереходы, в Западном Иерусалиме объявили о внедрении нового механизма распределения помощи, который, как стало известно, не получил поддержки ни от секретариата ООН, ни от его гуманитарных партнеров, работающих непосредственно на земле. Продвигая эту инициативу, руководство Израиля фактически призывает структуры Всемирной организации стать соучастниками собственной военной операции, тем самым ставя под угрозу нейтралитет и беспристрастность гуманитарной деятельности. В таких условиях трудно рассчитывать, что даже при реализации израильских планов удастся эффективно оказать помощь 2 миллионам палестинцев, оказавшихся заложниками этих политических и военных решений. Господин председатель, гуманитарные работники в Газе и на западном берегу реки Иордан ежедневно рискуют жизнью, выполняя свою миссию. Эти мужественные люди продолжают сталкиваться с угрозами, нападениями и систематическим препятствованием своей деятельности. Число жертв среди гуманитарного персонала неуклонно растет. С октября 2023 года было убито 418 сотрудников, из которых 295 работники ООН, а 290 представителей БАПО. Эти цифры в очередной раз свидетельствуют о неэффективности продвигаемого секретариатом ООН механизма деконфликтинга, который, к сожалению, не уберегает гуманитарщиков от гибели. Не можем не напомнить об инциденте с гуманитарным конвоем палестинского общества Красного полумесяца, члены которого 23 марта были хладнокровно расстреляны военными Цахал в окрестностях Рафаха. Погибли 8 медиков, 5 служащих гражданской обороны и сотрудник БАПО. Израиль признал свою причастность и запустил процесс расследования. Однако мы до сих пор не получили доказательств того, что, как утверждали израильские представители, в машине скорой помощи находятся представители Хамаса. Это вопиющая ситуация, которая должна быть тщательно расследована. Ситуация же, в которой оказалась БАПОР и его сотрудники, вообще не выдерживает никакой критики. Агентство, более 75 лет оказывающее жизненно важную помощь палестинцам, планомерно выдавливается с оккупированной палестинской территории, включая Восточный Иерусалим. Медицинские и образовательные учреждения агентства подвергаются обстрелам и разрушению, а его сотрудники – физическим расправам, допросам и преследованиям. Мы с тревогой получаем сведения о новых актах насилия, атаках на школы БАПОР, захват учебных заведений и центров временного размещения перемещенных лиц. В этом контексте хотели бы напомнить, что упомянутые инциденты представляют собой грубые нарушения норм МГП и принципа неприкосновенности объектов Всемирной организации. Сложившееся положение требует немедленных и решительных мер. Гарантии беспрепятственного и устойчивого доступа к гуманитарной помощи – это пусть и не универсальное, но абсолютно необходимое условие для облегчения страданий мирных жителей Газы. Это прежде всего вопрос элементарной человечности. Призываем Израиль обеспечить защиту гуманитарного персонала и отменить гуманитарную блокаду, которая является грубым нарушением статей 55, 56 и 59 4-й Женевской конвенции об адекватном снабжении гражданского населения на оккупированной территории. Господин председатель, как мы с вами уже неоднократно убеждались, пока идут активные боевые действия, налаживание полноценного гуманитарного доступа и обеспечение безопасности гуманитарных работников задача невыполнимая. В этом контексте хотели бы вновь призвать стороны к немедленному и безусловному прекращению огня и возобновлению второй фазы переговоров, предусматривающей освобождение насильственно удерживаемых лиц и вывод израильских подразделений из Газы. Мы приветствуем освобождение Хамаса американо-израильского заложника Идана Александра. Надеемся, что этот жест доброй воли поспособствует скорейшему достижению договоренности между Хамасом и Израилем при посредничестве Египта, Катара и Соединенных Штатов. Подобный сценарий мог бы стать прологом к перезапуску мирного процесса на двугосударственной основе, конечная цель которого – создание независимого палестинского государства в границах 1967 года со столицей в Восточном Иерусалиме, сосуществующего в мире безопасности с Израилем. Важной вехой на этом пути призвана стать международная конференция высокого уровня в поддержку двугосударственного решения палестино-израильского конфликта в июне в Нью-Йорке, сопредседателями которой выступают Саудовская Аравия и Франция, намеренным принять в ней активное участие. Благодарю вас.
I thank the Permanent Representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. I now give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I thank the United Kingdom, France, Denmark, Slovenia, and Greece for requesting this timely meeting, which is also supported by Algeria and Guyana. I also thank Under-Secretary General Tom Fletcher and Director Angelica Jacom for their very important, compelling yet sobering briefings. Sierra Leone expresses its deep appreciation to all humanitarian personnel who continue to deliver life-saving assistance under the most trying and dangerous conditions in the Gaza Strip. We pay tribute to the humanitarian personnel who have made the ultimate sacrifice in service of humanity. Sierra Leone remains gravely concerned by the worsening humanitarian situation in Gaza. This Council's attention is once again drawn to the continued humanitarian crisis in both the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and to the risk that humanitarian workers face daily in their efforts to provide essential services for civilian survival. According to the most recent report, over 62,000 Palestinians have been killed, the majority of whom are women and children. At least 1.7 million people have been forcibly displaced. Entire neighborhoods have been reduced to rubble, critical infrastructure destroyed, and nearly all hospitals rendered inoperable. The risk of famine, particularly in northern Gaza, is imminent. As briefed, and it bears repeating, the most recent Integrated Food Security Phase Classification estimates that approximately 2.1 million people, the entire Gaza Strip, face a critical risk of famine, with over 500,000 confronting starvation, following 19 months of conflict, mass displacement, severe restrictions on humanitarian access, and the collapse of the food system. The absence of food, medicine, and clean water is contributing to the spread of disease and rising mortality, especially in overcrowded and unsanitary IDP camps. Children and the most vulnerable remain disproportionately affected, malnourished, traumatized, and exposed. The postponement of the fourth round of the polio vaccination is deeply concerning and increases the risk of outbreak. Beyond this, the continued blockade severely limits delivery of medical supplies and care. The scale of human loss, displacement, and the destruction is unprecedented. As the Secretary General of the United Nations stated, and I quote,
Gaza is becoming a graveyard for children, end of quote, describing the situation as a moral outrage and a humanitarian catastrophe, and warning that we are facing a severe risk of collapse of the humanitarian system. These words, grounded in fact, must compel urgent and unified global action. As a Council and as an international community, we must not allow this immense suffering to be normalized. We must act with urgency, clarity, and compassion. The cost of inaction or the selective engagement is measured not only in the rising death toll, but in the erosion of global trust in the multilateral system. Mr. President, the ongoing hostilities, coupled with the blockade of humanitarian and commercial goods, and the widespread displacement of civilians, continue to obstruct humanitarian operations and deepen the suffering of the population. Sierra Leone affirms that the parties must strictly adhere to international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Under the Fourth Geneva Convention, the State of Israel, as the occupying power, bears the primary responsibility for the safety and well-being of the civilian population under its effective control. This includes the obligation to facilitate humanitarian relief, safeguard civilian infrastructure, and uphold the principle of non-discrimination in aid provision. We stress that all humanitarian activities within the Gaza Strip and the West Bank must be conducted in accordance with the humanitarian principles of neutrality, impartiality, and independence, with the protection and welfare of civilians as a central focus. This includes the work of UNRWA, mandated by the General Assembly, to assist Palestinian refugees pending a just and lasting political solution. Further, we must note that the right to self-defense must not be interpreted in ways that nullify the core principles of international law, not least in the situation of occupation. As Secretary General has reminded this Council, and I quote, "While the State of Israel has legitimate security concerns, the manner in which it is pursuing its military operations is causing massive civilian casualties and destruction," end of quote. The principle of proportionality must be upheld. Civilians and civilian objects are not lawful targets. We also reiterate that non-state actors, including Hamas and other armed groups, have obligations under international humanitarian law. Attacks targeting civilians, the taking of hostages, the use of civilian areas for military operations are unlawful and must cease. Mr. President, more generally, Sierra Leone is increasingly alarmed by the erosion of respect for international legal norms in the context of the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory. The provision of military assistance without adequate regard for humanitarian law may amount to the facilitation of violations of international law. International law must therefore be applied consistently and impartially. Otherwise, impunity will prevail. In this regard, Sierra Leone notes the orders of the provisional measures issued. Sierra Leone notes the orders of provisional measures issued by the International Court of Justice in the case brought by South Africa against the State of Israel under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. The court has ordered Israel to, and I quote, "take all measures within its powers to prevent the commission of acts prohibited under Article 2 of the Convention, including," and I quote, "deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction of the Palestinian people," end of quote. The court also ordered that Israel must ensure with immediate effect that its military forces do not commit any of the above described acts, and to take effective measures to enable the provision of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance. These are binding legal obligations. Sierra Leone urges full compliance with these measures and notes that continued obstruction of humanitarian access or the imposition of life-threatening conditions may give rise to international legal responsibility. Mr. President, the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza is inseparable from its broader political and historical context. The protracted occupation of Palestinian territory, now in its 76th year, combined with the absence of a credible political process and the continued denial of the Palestinian right to self-determination, lies at the root of the repeated cycles of violence, including the tragedy on and since 7th October 2023. Sierra Leone believes that unless the root causes, occupation, settlement expansion, and political exclusion are addressed, the prospect for durable peace will remain out of reach. Therefore, the persistent resort to measures amounting to collective punishment is contrary to international humanitarian law and a key driver for instability. Impunity and exclusion only perpetuate the cycle of violence. Sustainable peace must be anchored in law, justice, and political will. We therefore join others in calling for an immediate and sustained ceasefire, unimpeded humanitarian access to all available channels, the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure, and the release of all hostages. Sustained diplomatic engagement is essential to consolidate any ceasefire and address outstanding political and humanitarian concerns. We welcome the release of one of the remaining 59 hostages and reiterate our demand for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held since 7th October 2023. Sierra Leone reaffirms its unwavering support for a negotiated, just, and lasting solution based on relevant Security Council and General Assembly resolutions, resulting in two states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace and security within internationally recognized borders. And I thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Sierra Leone for his statement, and now I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of the Russian Federation. Oh, sorry. And now give the floor to the Permanent Representative of China. Sorry.
谢谢主席。我感谢英国、法国、丹麦、斯洛文尼亚和希腊倡议召开今天的会议，感谢 Fletcher 副秘书长和雅克姆主任所做的通报。加沙已经成为人间炼狱，以色列持续轰炸、袭击，每天都在造成新的无辜平民伤亡。仅5月7日一天就夺去100多条鲜活的生命。在长达2个多月的封锁下，加沙生存物资已消耗殆尽，饥饿和疾病迅速蔓延。根据粮食安全阶段综合分类报告，加沙民众正在经历严重的粮食短缺，近50万人处于灾难性饥饿。我们呼吁国际社会汇聚一切努力，采取紧急行动，为加沙人道惨剧画上句号。我讲3点：第一，恢复人道援助是当务之急，以色列必须履行占领方的国际人道法义务，立即解除封锁，全面恢复物资准入。加沙已成为人道工作者最危险的地方，已有400多名人道工作者在本轮冲突中遇难。我们对所有遇难的人道工作者表示哀悼，呼吁进行彻查追责。联合国近东巴勒斯坦难民救济和工程处的尊严、安全和便利应当得到尊重和保障。近日，有关国家提出了所谓人道物资分配计划，我们注意到联合国已予以明确拒绝。人道救援不能被武器化，公正、独立和中立原则必须始终得到坚持。第二，实现持久停火是优先事项。军事手段无法解决问题，延长战事只会制造更多的杀戮和死亡，不会为解救人质创造有利条件。中方敦促以色列立即停止对加沙的军事进攻。昨天，一名美籍人质获释回家，我们对此表示欢迎。 希望美国作为对当事方有重要影响力的国家，秉持公正和负责任的态度，为推动加沙停火做出更多的积极努力。第三，落实两国方案是唯一出路。国际社会应共同拒绝任何侵蚀两国方案基础的单边行动，加大努力为推进两国方案政治进程提供支持和保障。根据联大决议授权，落实两国方案高级别会议将于6月举行。希望本次会议为凝聚国际社会广泛共识，采取务实行动，落实两国方案注入新的动力。中方将继续同国际社会一道，为平息加沙战火、缓解人道灾难、落实两国方案，最终实现巴勒斯坦问题全面、公正、持久解决做出不懈努力。谢谢主席。
I thank the Permanent Representative of China for his statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as representative of Greece. I also wish to thank USG for Humanitarian Affairs, Mr. Tom Fletcher, and the Director of the FAO Office in New York, Mrs. Jacom, for the briefings today. Colleagues, no humanitarian aid has reached the people of Gaza in more than 2 months. Their needs cannot wait, especially the needs of the most vulnerable groups, including children, at a time where the World Food Programme food stocks are depleted and community kitchens continue to shut down. Children are also in need of routine vaccinations at a time when the danger of waterborne diseases and infections still lurks. Water sanitation and hygiene insecurity, the dysfunctionality or complete shutdown of healthcare clinics, the extremely limited access to fuel, as well as increased number of robbery and looting incidents, paint a bleak picture. While the hostilities have regrettably resumed and the negotiations are continuing, the issue of the distribution of aid needs to be properly addressed. We call for the safe, unconditional, massive and unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid at scale and to restore access to electricity and water. Next steps should be determined based on dialogue and cooperation. The UN has repeatedly asserted its readiness to scale up the delivery of critical supplies and services once the blockade is lifted. It is crucial, though, to ensure that any proposed scheme adheres to the core principles of international humanitarian law, namely humanity, impartiality, independence and neutrality. Furthermore, any plan should include all parts of Gaza, taking into account the needs of the less mobile and most vulnerable parts of its population. Its role should be complementary and supportive to the existing humanitarian operations within the Strip. Last but not least, certain security standards should be applied so as to avoid any further instability and prevent Hamas from continuing to instrumentalize humanitarian aid at the expense of the civilian population. The protection of civilians and their unimpeded access to humanitarian aid and services must remain a non-negotiable, absolute principle at all times, as proclaimed by international law, and specifically by the Geneva Conventions. The same principles apply to humanitarian workers whose safety and security is jeopardized on a daily basis. Humanitarian operations continue to be subject to severe movement restrictions, military activity and attacks. These actions not only disrupt aid operations, they endanger the lives of aid workers. Dear colleagues, we join fellow member states in welcoming the release of Eden Alexander yesterday. All hostages must be treated humanely and be released immediately and unconditionally. Members of the Security Council have been consistently clear on this since the October 7 terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas that Greece has repeatedly condemned. The humanitarian situation in the rest of the occupied Palestinian territories is worsening as well. We are very much concerned by the recent closure orders against 6 UNRWA schools in East Jerusalem, as well as over the continued attacks on schools sheltering displaced people, including the recent attack on an UNRWA school in Al-Bureij, with dozens of people reportedly killed, including women and children. Education is not a privilege, it's a basic human right and must be protected at all times. UNRWA's role remains pivotal and indispensable in this regard. We also express concern over reports of continuous settler violence in the West Bank, where more than 40,000 people remain displaced, Palestinian-owned properties are demolished and seized, and settlement activities have significantly increased. Colleagues, we urge the parties to this conflict to make a sincere effort to negotiate and achieve a permanent ceasefire. We also reiterate our call for the immediate release of all hostages. Our goal remains a two-state solution in accordance with the Security Council resolution, where Palestine and Israel can live in peace and security. We repeat our position that the Arab plan for Gaza, as presented by Egypt, constitutes a good starting point towards planning reconstruction. Any day after scenario should ensure the leading role for a reformed Palestinian Authority, and Hamas can have no role in the day after in Gaza and in the region, nor should be in a position to threaten Israel. We commend Egypt and Qatar and the United States for their persistent mediation efforts. We are also looking forward to the upcoming June conference under the co-presidency of France and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, a potential critical milestone in promoting the two-state solution and enduring peace in the region. After all, peace can only be achieved through dialogue, diplomacy, and mutual understanding. Thank you. I resume now my functions as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to the Permanent Observer State of Palestine.
Mr. President, allow me at the outset to thank the UK, France, Denmark, Greece, and Slovenia, as well as Algeria and Guyana for calling for this meeting regarding the horrific humanitarian situation in Gaza, and to thank you, Mr. President, for convening it in a timely manner. Allow me also to thank Under-Secretary General Tom Fletcher for his distressing briefing and for his relentless appeals for humanity in the face of persistent horrors, and for his efforts together with the UN system as a whole at a time of grave crisis. Allow me further to thank Director Angelica Jacom of FAO for the briefing on the latest IPC report, which stressed that, and I quote, "goods indispensable for people's survival are either depleted or expected to run out in the coming weeks. The entire population is facing high levels of acute food insecurity," end of quotation. And starvation is the fate imminently faced by at least 500,000 people. Mr. President, 93% of Gaza's children, 930,000 children, are at critical risk of famine. Not because there is no food. Food is there, a few meters away, rotting instead of reaching those who desperately need it. But because Israel has been openly and brazenly blocking humanitarian aid for over 2 months now, this is engineered starvation. It is the most inhumane form of torture and killing. 2.1 million people are at risk of famine, with 500,000 faced with a catastrophic situation of hunger and starvation, illness, and death. If the situation persists, nearly 71,000 children under the age of 5 are expected to be acutely malnourished. Israel is weaponizing aid, unleashing famine, which impact is felt most by the smallest children. If ever more proof was needed for the intention to destroy the Palestinian people in Gaza, this manufactured famine is the ultimate proof. Mr. President, Netanyahu was clear yet again about the goals of this war against our people. He said before the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee of the Israeli Knesset on Sunday, and I quote, "We are destroying more and more homes. They have nowhere to return to. The only inevitable outcome will be the wish of Gazans to immigrate outside of the Gaza Strip," end of quotation. He is confessing that it is the destruction and death that Israel is wantonly and deliberately spreading that will force Palestinians in Gaza to leave, and that it is indeed Israel's intent to forcibly remove them. Destructions of a people by death and displacement by endless atrocities. Mr. President, the Israeli plan for the so-called distribution of humanitarian aid continues pursuing these same illegal objectives by other means. That plan has been rejected by all UN agencies and all humanitarian organizations, as it is just a continuation of the weaponization of aid by driving desperate civilians and humanitarians into militarized zones to receive or distribute aid at the peril of their lives, by counting calories, by denying aid to many, often the most vulnerable, and by further subjugating the population and entrenching forcible displacement. Any relief scheme needs to adhere to the humanitarian principles of humanity, impartiality, independence, and neutrality. The only reason behind the horrific humanitarian situation is Israel's persistent denial and blocking of aid. That is the problem that must be addressed. Significant humanitarian stocks are available, ready to enter as soon as the blockade is lifted. This makes the situation even more unbearable, even more inhumane, even more revolting. Mr. President, we hope that following the release of Idan Alexander, through the efforts of the United States, Qatar, and Egypt, that we will see the mediators succeed in pushing forward an immediate ceasefire that leads to stopping the bloodshed, addressing the catastrophic humanitarian situation, releasing the hostages and detainees, and to the withdrawal of Israeli occupation forces and the securing of a permanent ceasefire. For now, Israel is continuing to bomb hospitals and shelters and is promising more death and destruction. This madness must be stopped. President Trump declared from Saudi Arabia today that the United States was continuing to work to end the war as quickly as possible. We hope that President Trump's visit to the region will allow to achieve such a ceasefire and to build a political horizon of freedom for the Palestinian people, security for all, and shared prosperity for our region. Let me also seize this opportunity to welcome President Trump's announcement on lifting the sanctions over Syria, and to reiterate our call for the full respect of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria and Lebanon, which together with ending the illegal Israeli occupation of Palestine can transform our region. We look forward to the convening of the International Conference for the peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine and the implementation of the two-state solution, co-chaired by Saudi Arabia and France in June. We hope it will mark a turning point from occupation to freedom, from death to life, from conflicts to shared peace and security. Mr. President, we have witnessed as aid has been completely denied for 10 weeks in breach of every tenet of international humanitarian law, of this Council's resolutions, of every call by the General Assembly, of the ICJ Provisional Measures Orders. We have seen all supplies blocked from entering Gaza, even those indispensable to the very survival of the civilian population. We saw bakeries having to shut their doors, community kitchens closing down, warehouses standing empty, children going hungry. Children died of malnutrition in Gaza. According to the WHO, and I quote, "Without enough nutritious food, clean water, and access to health care, an entire generation will be permanently affected." End of quotation. Time is our enemy, especially as hunger eats away at our children, at our babies, at their mothers, entire families left without food and clean water and shelter, with bombs for only horizon and only supply, facing their demise as the genocide continues, crushing their bodies one way or another or the other. When faced with such an unbearable, inhumane situation, the international community cannot wait, nor resign, nor surrender. It has to act by any and all means necessary. You have tools available to you to act if you wish, if you decide to use them, collectively as a council or in your national capacity as countries, if you are truly serious about putting an end to this crime against the Palestinian civilian population, especially in the Gaza Strip. Let me remind you of the concluding words of USG Tom Fletcher today, and I quote, "And for those who will not survive, what we fear is coming in plain sight. It will be no consolation to know that future generations will hold us in this chamber to account, but they will. And if we have not seriously done all we could, we should fear that judgment." End of quotation. And we salute him for all the things that he said in his statement today. It's a challenge to this chamber, to the Security Council, and to each and every one of you in your national capacity, and for the rest of the world who is watching us and all the countries outside this chamber of the Security Council. We call on the states represented around this table, on the Security Council as a body, on the General Assembly, and on all states represented within these United Nations to consider as a matter of urgency all possible steps, barring none, to break this inhumane siege imposed over 2 million people and to end this violent forced famine. This cannot be left to the whims of an Israeli government obsessed with dispossessing and displacing and destroying our people. It is our collective obligation to find a way forward in the next few days if this situation persists, to save the millions of lives that hang in the balance. End the famine, end the inhumanity, end the genocide, end the occupation. Let the Palestinian people live in freedom and dignity. Let all peoples in our region live in peace. Thank you.
The permanent observer State of Palestine for his statement. I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. Before I begin, I want to express Israel's relief in seeing Idan Alexander return home after almost 600 days of Hamas captivity. We were honored to welcome his parents, Adi and Yael, to the United Nations just a few months ago. Their strengths moved us all. We thank the United States for its role in securing Idan's release. We also reaffirm that Israel will not rest until every last one of the 58 remaining hostages is brought home. The reports emerging from Idan's time in captivity are deeply disturbing. Idan was subjected to constant torture, tied in a cage by his hands and feet, and starved. This is the reality of Hamas's treatment of hostages. This is why we must bring them all back. I listened carefully to all of your statements today. But when I saw the video of Idan's mother embracing him after almost 600 days apart, I was reminded what this is really about. Mothers reuniting with their children. That is what we are fighting for. Mr. President, less than 2 months ago, a man stood before this council. His name was Eli Sharabi, frail, traumatized, and still mourning the murder of his wife and 2 daughters and brother by Hamas terrorists. He somehow found the strength to testify about his experience as a hostage in the hands of Hamas. He spoke for truth and for justice. In that testimony, I want to remind you, he revealed what we have been saying for years and what many in this room have ignored. Hamas steals humanitarian aid. He told you that he had seen with his own eyes UN aid packages carried into Hamas tunnels. He watched as the terrorists ate like kings while he and his fellow hostages were left to starve. Let that image sink in. The aid you sent, the aid your taxpayers funded, the aid you believed would help civilians, the aid marked by UN and UNRWA emblems, it was used to feed terrorists, to massacre women and children. Israel will not allow that to continue. We will not allow the old broken system to remain in place. We will not accept a humanitarian mechanism that props up the terror organization that butchered our people. We will not sit idly by as food, fuel, and funds meant for civilians are funneled into the Hamas terror machine. We will never allow our morality to be weaponized against us again. We appreciate the efforts to build a new mechanism, one grounded in accountability, one that ensures aid reaches civilians, not terrorists. Simply put, we will not allow the mistakes of the past to repeat themselves. However, I have been here for many years in this building. It was shocking to see that even before the proposal had been finalized or made public, the UN and the Secretary General had already dismissed it. How many meetings we had about this proposal? The Secretary General said he refused to engage in, and I quote, any scheme, that's how he called it, that in his view does not meet the principles of, and I quote, impartiality, humanity, independence, and neutrality. The irony is unbelievable, as the previous mechanism made a mockery of every one of those principles. That is not diplomacy. That is not neutrality. That is sabotage disguised as principle. It is outrageous that the UN, an organization built upon global cooperation and dialogue, refuses to engage with states offering real solutions. Rather than fix our broken system, senior UN officials, including Secretary General Guterres, are refusing to admit the system has failed. We can only reach one conclusion. The UN wants to preserve a humanitarian framework that serves Hamas, a system that feeds terrorists while civilians and hostages starve, a system that failed the people of Gaza and failed the hostages, all because of optics and politics. To Secretary General Guterres, I say this: the aid that ended up in Hamas's hands did not bring hope. It did not bring progress. It brought death. That path leads nowhere. Mr. Guterres, you are invited to return to the table. But if you do come with open eyes and open ears, something can be achieved. Hamas was allowed to seize aid and take control over the population of Gaza. You saw the consequences of that mistake on October 7th. It cannot be unseen. The old system fed terrorists while civilians suffered and Israelis were burned alive. That cannot and that will not be repeated. Colleagues, every day we hear baseless and outrageous accusations directed at Israel, that we are committing war crimes, that we are starving civilians, that we are deliberately obstructing aid. But here is a test. If the officials making these accusations truly believed them, they would be doing everything in their power to make a change, to contribute. They would be engaging in constructive dialogue to ensure aid gets to civilians, not to terrorists. Instead, they have chosen slander over solutions. We have, as you all know, facilitated in the past the entry of over 1.7 million metric tons of humanitarian assistance into Gaza. This is food, water, medicine, fuel, shelter equipment. We have worked with international partners to get aid to those in need. Despite all of this, the misinformation continues. Just yesterday, the IPC once again released a report claiming that Gaza is, and I quote, facing famine. That's a new terminology. We have heard that before. The IPC has made the same claim multiple times throughout this conflict in the last 18 months. Every time it has proven to be completely false. Even the IPC's own analysis confirms there is no famine in Gaza, but they continue to use exaggerated language based purely on flawed assumptions and scenarios that have not happened. The IPC does not collect its own data. It relies only on UN sources that reflected only 1/3 of the actual aid that entered Gaza during the ceasefire. That is deliberate manipulation. The IPC ignored the massive volumes of food and supplies that entered Gaza during the pause in fighting. They ignored our detailed assessments and our warnings of their failures. But most of all, they refused to respond to the evidence we presented because it just didn't fit the narrative. The reality is that Hamas has made the previous aid system impossible. Not only do they steal the aid, loot the convoys, and execute their own people, but I remind the Council that Hamas continues to hold 58 innocent hostages as we speak. They don't receive aid. So when the UN insists on returning to the old framework, it is not choosing neutrality, it is choosing denial. We are grateful to the United States for its leadership in this new effort. We welcome the constructive engagement of other member states and NGOs who have recognized the need for reform. To those who denounce us, I say this. If you demand that Israel facilitate aid while ignoring how that aid has been used by terrorists, then you are not defending international law. You are destroying it. Direct your outrage and frustration at the terrorist organization that steals the aid you pay for. Esteemed council members, there are hostages still held underground. We will defend our people. We will bring our hostages home, and we will not contribute to any mechanism that enables the enemy who brought war to our doorstep on October 7th. To the Secretary General, to the UN leadership, and to every member state at this table, you are invited to help build something better, to let go of the broken past and embrace a more accountable, more secure future for all. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Israel for his statement, and now I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of the United Arab Emirates.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. يطيب لي أن أتقدم لكم بالتهنئة على توليكم رئاسة مجلس الأمن هذا الشهر، كما أشكر كل من السيد توم فلتشر والسيدة أنجليكا جاكوم على إحاطتهما القيمتين. ويسرني أن ألقي هذا البيان نيابة عن المجموعة العربية. تثمن المجموعة العربية عقد هذا الاجتماع الطارئ، خاصة في ظل استمرار إسرائيل في حربها الغاشمة على غزة ومساعيها لفرض سيطرة دائمة عليها، مع تعنتها في مواصلة حصارها الشامل لغزة منذ ما يزيد عن 10 أسابيع، وحظرها لدخول أي إمدادات إلى القطاع، حتى تلك التي تعد ضرورية لبقاء المدنيين على قيد الحياة، مما أدى إلى تفاقم أزمة المجاعة في غزة، حيث وكما استمعنا قبل قليل أكد تقرير التصنيف المرحلي المتكامل الصادر يوم الاثنين أن كامل سكان قطاع غزة البالغ عددهم 2.1 مليون نسمة يواجهون خطر المجاعة، من بينهم 500,000 يعانون الجوع الكارثي، أي المرحلة الخامسة والأشد من التصنيف، وأكثر من 71,000 طفل يحتاجون إلى علاج عاجل من سوء التغذية الحاد. وفي هذا السياق تشدد المجموعة العربية على رفضها للنظام المقترح من إسرائيل بشأن المساعدات، والذي يخالف مبادئ العمل الإنساني، ويسعى لإجبار الأمم المتحدة والمنظمات الإنسانية على إدخال وتوزيع المساعدات في غزة من خلال 5 نقاط، مما يتناقض مع التزامات إسرائيل بموجب القانون الدولي الإنساني، ويتجاهل التدابير المؤقتة التي صدرت عن محكمة العدل الدولية، والتي تتطلب تقديم المساعدة الإنسانية دون عوائق، ويحرم الآلاف من السكان من المساعدات المنقذة للحياة، وبالأخص النساء وكبار السن والمصابين، ويزيد المخاطر الأمنية التي تواجه العمليات الإنسانية في مسعى إسرائيلي واضح لتحويل العمل الإنساني إلى أداة للسيطرة السياسية والعسكرية. وتقدر المجموعة جهود الوساطة التي بذلتها جمهورية مصر العربية ودولة قطر والولايات المتحدة، التي أدت إلى التوصل إلى اتفاق وقف إطلاق النار في يناير الماضي، مما ساهم في تخفيف المعاناة الإنسانية، والتي تستمر حالياً بغية ضمان تحقيق وقف دائم لإطلاق النار، واستئناف دخول المساعدات الإنسانية، وتبادل الأسرى والمحتجزين. وفي هذا السياق ترحب المجموعة بإطلاق سراح الرهينة الأمريكي عيدان ألكسندر، بوصفه خطوة مشجعة للوصول إلى وقف إطلاق نار دائم. وتجدد المجموعة العربية مطالبتها بإنهاء العدوان الإسرائيلي على غزة واستئناف تنفيذ وقف إطلاق النار وفقاً لقرار مجلس الأمن 2735، ووقف كافة الانتهاكات ضد المدنيين والبنية التحتية المدنية والعاملين الإنسانيين بمن فيهم العاملين في المجال الطبي، والإفراج عن الأسرى والمحتجزين. ونشدد على ضرورة محاسبة المسؤولين عن كافة الانتهاكات الجسيمة واحترام القانون الدولي بما في ذلك القانون الدولي الإنساني. كما تطالب المجموعة إسرائيل بالسماح بإدخال المساعدات الإنسانية بشكل عاجل وشامل ودون عوائق، وفتح كافة المعابر، والوفاء بالتزاماتها كقوة قائمة بالاحتلال، بما في ذلك الالتزامات المتعلقة بتواجد وأنشطة الأمم المتحدة وغيرها من المنظمات الدولية والدول الثالثة في الأرض الفلسطينية المحتلة، وهو ما أكد عليه المتداخلون في جلسات الاستماع التي عقدتها محكمة العدل الدولية مؤخرا في إطار طلب الرأي الاستشاري المرفوع إليها في هذا الشأن. وفي هذا الصدد ندين القيود التعسفية التي فرضتها إسرائيل على وكالة الأونروا والقرارات الباطلة لحظر عملها، والتي تهدف لتقويض حل الدولتين وتصفية قضية اللاجئين، فضلا عما تمثله من انتهاك جسيم للولاية التي منحتها الجمعية العامة لوكالة الأونروا لتقديم الدعم الإنساني والتنموي للاجئين الفلسطينيين في جميع مناطق عملها. ونطالب المجتمع الدولي بتعزيز الدعم السياسي والمالي للوكالة ضمانا لاستمرارها في أداء دورها الذي لا غنى عنه. ونجدد تأكيدنا على حق اللاجئين الفلسطينيين في العودة والتعويض تماشيا مع القرارات الأممية ذات الصلة. وتشدد المجموعة العربية على رفضها القاطع لمحاولات التهجير القسري للشعب الفلسطيني والاستيلاء على أرضه وتاريخه، وتدين التصريحات الإسرائيلية حول توسيع نطاق الحملة العسكرية في غزة لتشمل تهجير غالبية سكان القطاع في انتهاك صارخ للقانون الدولي. وبالمقابل تؤكد المجموعة على محورية الخطة العربية الإسلامية للتعافي المبكر وإعادة إعمار وتنمية غزة المقدمة من مصر بالتنسيق مع دولة فلسطين، والتي لاقت ترحيبا دوليا واسع النطاق. وفي هذا السياق نحث المجتمع الدولي والشركاء الإقليميين والدوليين على توفير الدعم السياسي والمالي اللازم لتنفيذ الخطة والمشاركة بفعالية في المؤتمر المنتظر استضافته في القاهرة لبحث سبل إعادة إعمار القطاع. وتعرب المجموعة العربية عن إدانتها الشديدة للتصعيد الإسرائيلي في الضفة الغربية والقدس الشرقية المحتلة، المتمثل في الاقتحامات العسكرية وتوسيع المستوطنات وهدم المنازل وضم الأراضي وترسيخ الاحتلال، بما في ذلك الاقتحامات المتكررة من قبل المستوطنين والوزراء المتطرفين في الحكومة الإسرائيلية بحماية من قوات الاحتلال للمسجد الأقصى المبارك الحرم القدسي الشريف. وتشدد المجموعة على وجوب احترام الوضع القانوني والتاريخي القائم للمقدسات الإسلامية والمسيحية في مدينة القدس. سيد الرئيس، إن هذا المجلس الذي عهد أعضاء الأمم المتحدة إليه بالمسؤولية الرئيسية عن صون السلم والأمن الدوليين مطالب باتخاذ موقف حازم من هذه التطورات اللا إنسانية من أجل وقف الحرب بشكل دائم وشامل، وإطلاق سراح الأسرى والمحتجزين، ورفع الحصار، والسماح بإيصال المساعدات، ووقف التهجير القسري. وبالتوازي مع مسار وقف إطلاق النار، فأمامنا موعد تاريخي هام في يونيو المقبل لإعادة إحياء حل الدولتين عبر المؤتمر الدولي رفيع المستوى المزمع عقده في نيويورك برئاسة مشتركة من المملكة العربية السعودية وفرنسا. وندعو المجتمع الدولي والأطراف المعنية إلى تكثيف الجهود لضمان خروج هذا المؤتمر بنتائج ملموسة يمكن البناء عليها لإطلاق مسار سياسي جاد وفاعل يفضي إلى حل عادل ودائم للصراع مبني على حل الدولتين وفقا لقرارات الشرعية الدولية بما يضمن تجسيد الدولة الفلسطينية المستقلة وعاصمتها القدس الشريف ويحقق الاستقرار والسلام العادل والدائم في المنطقة. وشكرا سيد الرئيس.
I thank the permanent representative of the United Arab Emirates for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.
Stay calm, Hassad.